So before we get started with the levels and the skills, I'd like to show you some of my earlier work as I myself was going through all those same levels and trying to build all those same skills. When I was starting out, and really to be honest, I still do, I always look at what more advanced artists' beginner stages were, and I would always try and find their blogs, their DeviantArt, websites, old portfolios that they might have, and I would just kind of go through and look at what their beginning stages looked like. Because oftentimes when you're a beginner, it never feels like you're going to get better, or things just seem so distant that you're not even sure if you are not the worst that there's ever been and you're some sort of special case of never getting better. So I always like going through people's older work and seeing that we're all pretty similar in how we progress. It really is all about perseverance and who puts in the work over time and sticks to it. So one thing I decided to do is I renamed this first level. It was first called copying, but I didn't want to give the false impression that copying is somehow a goal. It's just that when you're at that first level, you're kind of relegated to copying. You can't really go beyond that. So I changed it though to observation. This is for the ones of you who are paying close attention. Yes, that's right, you caught me. So just so we have a framework as we're looking through the images, the first level is observation. The second one is going to be understanding. These are going to essentially be level 3, and they are when you get freed from the technical constraints of just trying to make something look like what it's supposed to look like, and then you have some perspective under your belt and you begin to be able to build a little bit more freely, three-dimensional volumes, connect them together, start to feel pictorial space. So not look at things as flat and just look at them as lines that are connected to each other with a certain two-dimensional quality, that things are only a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, a little bit higher up or a little bit down. You start looking at things not only as that, but you also start understanding that there's now a third dimension. Things are going up and down because they're going one behind the other, one in front of the other, etc. So level 3 is when you're able to do that a bit more intuitively, when you're feeling space, when you're feeling form. And in our writer metaphor, you're essentially able now not to think about how to make a letter and what the alphabet looks like, but you're able now to think about more what it is that you're saying. You're able to put these letters into sentences now, and you're beginning to make some paragraphs. Maybe even you make like a couple of quick stories here and there. So this is level 3, and it combines feeling form with now knowledge and design, which is when you begin to be a little bit more of a storyteller. And then the final stage is over here where it's imagination work, and really it's all of these previous levels all together. So observation, understanding, feeling form, and then a little bit of design in that same level, and then finally imagination. So I started in 2013 officially. That's when I decided that I'm going to take a year, that's what I thought at the time, to learn how to paint. That's really what I wanted to do. So I thought I would be painting, which is why most of my drawing at that first year, and really for quite a few years afterwards, mostly geared towards painting. I never really spent much time on structure and those things that we talked about today, and that's because I really didn't understand the importance of it, and I also didn't really see that they're there. I couldn't see that those things existed because I was looking at things through kind of the eyes of a painter. So I was mostly looking at things as shapes and trying to put down values and color. I really wasn't thinking about building objects. I wasn't thinking about three-dimensional space as much. And so 2013 is when I started, but obviously I didn't just kind of wake up one day and decide I'm going to be a painter and that's it. I was kind of just looking at things, and it wasn't even a hobby. It was just some sort of remote interest. But over the years, the few years before that, I just looked through some books and I just doodled here and there. And this is basically things that I found that I've saved. And really, these weren't practicing drawing as much. I was learning Photoshop. I was doing things like that. And I also happened to doodle as I would do that from time to time. Now, 2012 actually begins at a level that we don't even have on our chart. And really this is symbolic drawing. And this is why I wanted to include this over here, because as an absolute and utter beginner, it's not only skills that are missing, it's also an understanding, like a complete lack of understanding of the visual language. This is why a lot of beginner drawings violate so many rules, and you can practice, let's say your lines could improve, your values might improve, your technical side might be improving, but if you're not spending time also researching what it is exactly that we are doing. This is why I'm spending so much time on these things, because just like a writer, we need to have a good understanding of language, but not only that, we need to also know what makes a compelling story, what's important to tell and what's important to leave out. With a beginner, we tend to not have any idea of how to use the language at all. So we'll put words together that don't go together. We'll change syllables around. We'll mess words up. We'll put things together. We'll be using the wrong word and not making sense. So in the visual language, we tend to do the same thing. We overvalue certain things. We don't understand what is important and what isn't. A big part of being an artist is selection. It's knowing what to put in, but also knowing what to take out. And with a beginner, obviously that doesn't exist. We don't really understand what is important. So let's have a look at some of the drawings in the symbolic stage, and hopefully this will clarify a bit more about what I mean through symbols. So with symbolic drawing, you're not drawing what you're seeing. You're drawing what you know something to be like. Now the problem as a beginner is that you actually don't know what things are truly like because you haven't studied them. So you just have some sort of very vague, broad, general notion of what things should be like. And this is probably from cartoons, from previous drawings that we've done as kids and haven't really spent time in really understanding the visual language. So you can see all of these drawings that I have, I wasn't actually trying to do this. This is just truly a pattern that's here, and it's because of lack of understanding. You can see almost everything is either complete side view. So look at this guy. He's a complete side view. So there's absolutely no perspective. He isn't somehow facing you. So like his little squidgy body isn't just in any way oriented towards us. He's completely side view. And if you look at this other guy over here, he's completely front view. So there is never any perspective. And that's because at this stage, I don't even know that there's such a thing as perspective as I'm doing these things. And even if I'm trying to do something that is more familiar, like not just sketching like a weird creature, but if I'm even trying to make somewhat something resembling a person, I'm still drawing it very much with those symbolic shapes, like a rectangle for the body and another triangle here for the underpants, and then we have a cylinder and another one. These are very kind of primitive representations of what would actually be happening there. And this is a result, one, of not understanding, like I said. Two, though, is not using any reference. So I would actually be, I'm 100% certain that none of these things exist anywhere. Like this rubber ducky I have been looking at, I guess, but I was still trying to make things up. So I'm trying to make things up at a stage where I really can't be making things up. These drawings look better, and that's because these are actually referenced. These are copied. I remember this was from a children's drawing program. So this was this super nice lady, and she was teaching kindergartners how to draw. And I found this online somewhere, and I just did the same thing. And I copied her drawing, and it looked better, obviously, than anything I could do, because I was essentially, over here, I was copying the visual language of someone who understood the visual language better than I did. So all my stuff was just completely always flat on, either side view or front view. Things are also quite stiff. Apart from that, if you examine these things, let's say from a design standpoint, then all the shapes are quite stiff. They are pretty uniform, so they don't really have any dynamic or anything like that. They're just these big slow curves, and also the lines are quite all over the place. So I'm not sure if maybe that was because I was also learning to use a tablet at the time, or maybe it was just that hard for me. I'm really willing to believe that things truly were that hard at the time, and also using the tablet, it made it even worse. But you can see just how thick each and every single line is, because one, I wouldn't know what I'm doing, but two, I would just be having a hard time, I guess, doing the thing. Now here's something that is kind of compounding the problem. You can see that this is still just completely flat, so completely side view, no perspective whatsoever. Not only that, but look at this eye, and this truly is indicative of the symbolic drawing. Look at the fact that this eye is not actually in side view, so it isn't an eye that's in profile. This is an eye, I should draw it even more from the front. This is essentially a symbol for the eye from the front. So I've been trying to figure out what an eye looks like, but not only that, I'm also only familiar with what an eye looks like from the front. So I've drawn a front eye on a side view of this guy. So not using reference, a major issue at this stage. So really, I would have advised myself, if I'm wanting to do anything from imagination here, I would have told myself to just steer clear of doing anything without looking at things that already exist in the world or other drawings. And if it has to be something that I absolutely must improvise on, then just do a small little change to something that you can already see. And the idea behind that advice would be that I understand that my past self at that time had absolutely no understanding of what they were doing, and they couldn't really do anything from imagination because they didn't have anything stored in memory. A lot of imagination is just recombining knowledge and experience into new and interesting forms. When you don't have anything stored, you can't really make up anything interesting because you don't even know what interesting means at that time. So I would have advised myself to just work from other drawings, work from other objects and things like that. And if it absolutely must be with some sort of imaginary spin, because a lot of times at the beginning stages, we just want to be doing our own thing. We don't want to be doing someone else's thing. We don't want to be copying something. We want to be doing a new thing. So if you absolutely must, I would have advised myself, hey, you know what? Take some of these drawings, try and reproduce them first, just so you can train yourself and your mechanical skill at this level. And then afterwards, after you've done that, just then do a little variation on it, right? Leave me a copy so I can see the original that you've drawn and maybe we can critique that, and then show me how you would have changed it a little bit. So this is how I would have approached my training at that time if I could have given myself some advice. Now you can also see that adding value here, so adding tones, doesn't really help at this stage. So not only do I not understand structure, and I don't understand how to draw something three-dimensionally, and I don't really understand how to create overlap. And you can see, I mean, this guy is completely flat. He is just essentially, if we drew him from the top, he would be this essentially. There's just nothing to him. Maybe he would have like a little something here or there. But that's it. He's essentially just a cardboard cutout. This eye is in the exact same plane as the nose. He'd be just a sliver. He'd be something like this, basically. He doesn't have any structure. He doesn't have any skull. He doesn't have any sort of shape that could possibly be a creature of any sort. That's because that's just far beyond me at that stage. I couldn't even think of those things. I was just trying to make something that looks like a thing. That was basically my first goal. Make a thing that looks like a thing. And good luck. You can actually see there is a little bit of perspective right here, and it doesn't really match anything else. So this wasn't really, at this stage I was just experimenting. With a beginner, there's billions of different ways that you could possibly go about something, and that's because nothing really makes sense in your brain. So I was just trying to see, well, how do you make something look like it actually is going in space? How do you do that? And I actually remember from this lady, from this same kindergarten course, I remember this lady she said, make a zigzag line. I remember that. And then make another zigzag line. So do something like this. And now from those lines, just from the corners, just drop them down. And I remember just sitting there like, whoa. How did you do this? And I did it. I did the same thing and I had the same drawing. And I had things that now had overlap, that had dimension. I could even, let's say we can do something even more amazing. Now it's going behind this one. It's not only overlapping itself, it's being overlapped by another thing. Incredible. Then the problem was that once I learned that, this was kind of like a trick, a shortcut. So I really don't encourage those things. I don't find them very useful because I'm not blaming the lady, by the way. She had no idea that a 25-year-old guy was watching her. She was just showing kids how to do fun things. That's what she was doing. But if you're learning to draw and if you're serious about these things, then you need to start understanding form and construction and all this stuff. So I would do the same thing and I would do a zigzag, and sometimes I wouldn't be able to make the same thing. I wouldn't know how, let's say, if I didn't do the zigzag, well, if I did a zigzag like this, and do I just drop my lines going down again, I wouldn't really be able to understand what it is that I'm doing exactly. And you can see that this drawing here essentially has a changed camera, and this one where we have a certain viewpoint here and we have a certain viewpoint here, and we're more over top over here, more of an aerial view of this same thing. I really wasn't able to even compute that at the time. I would just be making shapes and I would try to see, well, if I do this, what happens? And if I do something like this, well, now what happens? And is it still working? Does it work now? Okay, quick scroll through the rest of these drawings. They essentially all have the same problem, so we don't need to go through absolutely everything. Absolutely flat on, flat on. This guy has a little bit of perspective. So I am in the back of my head probably trying. I may have read some books already and I'm maybe trying to apply some of these things. Cartman is copied for sure though. I know I did not come up with him. Maybe even this guy was copied. I may have been looking at something and trying to copy it and then just put a little bit of detail on him. But if we keep going, there are some attempts at perspective, but at this stage, without training, really, even if you understand the concepts intellectually, that really doesn't serve you much. It's not about being a theorist. It's not about reading 10, 20 books on perspective, which is what I was doing at first. It's about being able to take these concepts and really just drill down. Really not necessarily be able to draw from perspective like an architect and make all kinds of different plan projections and things like that, which is what I was trying to do at the beginning. It really is just about being able to feel space, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking things and we're going to be drawing stuff. We want to be making things up. We want to put things in space. We want to make him do things. This guy, for instance, even though I've put a crosshair, so even though I'm trying to practice some perspective here, you can actually see that these are completely flat on. So this is more like if it was just a flat oval over here and these were just two identical shapes on them. So it doesn't really have space. If this eye was indeed on a sphere, it would have to be receding, it would have to be foreshortened. This eye would have to be looking more at us, let's say, and this eye would be a little bit smaller. It would be going away. This whole thing is actually facing, the nose would be here, the mouth would be here, all of these things would have to shift, and then his belly would be over here, and his legs wouldn't be facing us. One of the legs would be here, and the other leg would be either overlapping the other, or it would be at least bigger, since there's perspective. Okay, and more of the same, basically. Just, that's why this stage is called No Idea. Because really at this point, I would just be trying stuff, but it really isn't guided in any way. And I'm just gonna jump over on this side over here, and these aren't my drawings, but really I was doing the exact same thing. You can see that these eyes are pretty symbolic. This is what, if you ask someone that doesn't draw, or if you ask a kid, hey, what's an eye look like? Well, this would be kind of a shape that does describe it. You have this circular idea, and then you have the eye itself. So you have the iris, then you have the pupil. That's about it for an eye. You don't necessarily know about the cornea, and you don't necessarily know that there's going to be a certain alignment between the top lid and the bottom lid, that they're going to have this diagonal. You don't necessarily know any of those things. You don't consider the thickness of the lids. You don't really look at any of those things. I mean, you can't. If you're just making it out of your head, you don't know the eye well enough to be able to do that. And if you did know the eye well enough, but you're still at this stage of drawing, so you're still very beginning stages, it's likely that you wouldn't have the technical facility to draw it. So in the symbolic stage, the eye would just be something like this, let's say. It might be round, or it may be a little bit more, let's say a little bit more of an almond shape, and you may have this circle inside. So it will be something like this. It's a vague idea, vague representation. It's a symbol of what an eye is, but it really doesn't represent what a true eye is really like. In order to make the real eye look like what it's supposed to look like, in order to make it more realistic, you would actually have to be, one, observing an eye, and then two, you would have to be thinking about what it is that you're doing. You can see that this eye over here, for instance, this was more than likely referenced, but the person is probably still just struggling with those same things, just the mechanical side of the drawing, trying to get things to be more of the correct shape. You see they're probably struggling with the alignment a little bit over here, trying to understand what is effective and what isn't. What should you draw and what shouldn't you draw as you're doing. And you can see some of the issues here is there actually is no bottom lid. So if we did some minor changes to this eye, I'm sure we could get it to read a little bit clearly. So if we just drop this down, okay, so I cheated a little bit and I put some tone over there, and it really doesn't have a great shape because the two lids really should be a little bit more of a different shape. But we can quickly make things a little bit more realistic if we know what it is that we're doing. So the difference between a more symbolic drawing and a more realistic drawing is essentially that with symbolic drawing, I don't know what it is that I'm doing. I'm drawing it out of my head. I don't have the mechanical training to do that. I don't have the understanding of the form and the structure of the object that I'm drawing. And I'm essentially drawing an iconic representation. I'm drawing it from the absolute front because that's really the only way that I'm familiar with this object, or from absolute side, or whatever the most iconic representation for that object is. I'm not really considering things like perspective or things like that. This is kind of a logo for what an eye is. This is also a logo. So these are essentially kind of the logo of the eye. But if your goal is to make realistic art, or at least something that is more realistic or more dimensional, then really you need to be looking at what things really look like, and then attempting to, at first stage, just replicate that, and then afterwards, with more training, with more knowledge, starting to be able to manipulate it. But drawing without reference and drawing without understanding are surefire ways to stay in symbolic drawing and to fail over and over again. Okay, this is kind of weird to draw. I want to show you that it really isn't about the use of line that makes something symbolic. It's about not paying attention to what's really out there, to what something truly looks like. So here I'm trying to essentially remove perspective. I'm also removing some of the more anatomical particularities. So this drawing was done by looking at the reference here. So I will be looking here and I'm only just drawing the lines that are kind of relevant to the volumes. I'm describing the volumes through simple lines here. And this is the result. It looks more realistic than this, because here I'm just trying to figure out, okay, if I'm to draw some of those early drawings that I showed you before when everything was two-dimensional, just what would it look like? What would my icon for that be? And I'm actually trying to remember, so this line probably maybe even go more horizontal. I'm trying to remember how I used to draw when I would be drawing like this. And it would be something like this. This would be a symbolic person. So there's no anatomy, there's no perspective. You can see that actually here, the chest, there's a rib cage obviously underneath, so there's the rib cage, and the chest is following that rib cage. So this point over here is in front of this point here, so this is receding from us. And also there's a clear underside here. So when I'm drawing here, I'm actually thinking about all these things, and these lines are just simple indications of all of those things that are happening in the actual image. So they're just a simple way to indicate these things. The major point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not a technique or a shortcut or some type of trick that you're using in order to make something look a certain way. All that you're doing is that you're thinking about certain things. Hence the metaphor, or being a writer. A more proficient writer, one that has better command of their language. They're able to think about the end result that they would like to have, and then they can produce that result more effectively. It's all about principles, and then after you can understand those, it's all about thinking. Thinking with lines, thinking with tone. That really is what makes an image. Okay, and final thing. This image that I'm using as a reference, it is from our friends over at New Masters Academy, and so is this and many other images that I use all the time in my own training. Okay, so moving beyond the symbolic stage, and after having gone through quite a few books at this time and looking at courses and all kinds of things like that all the time, and trying to piece together what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. So 2013, so I'll show you some of the work. Essentially, a lot of it at this stage is just copies. Like I said, I was trying to think more like a painter. I was trying to really paint more rather than draw, and I really wasn't understanding the value of drawing at this stage. So most of the things that you see are copies. They're basically just an attempt to look at something and kind of make the same thing. Like I call it, it's just trying to make a thing look like a thing. I'm not trying to do anything fancy. I'm just trying to basically work through this process and understand how things are made. And you can see sometimes I got it right, or at least a little bit better, and sometimes things didn't go so well. I really didn't have a good process or a good understanding of what I'm supposed to do over here. I would be copying things, but I wouldn't be sure what to copy, what's important, what's not. You can see that there really isn't any organization to the image. I'm not taking it and changing it in any way. All that I'm doing is I'm just trying to replicate exactly what it is that I'm seeing. And this can be quite a tough and also a boring way to do things, because really you're not doing anything. There's no creativity here or anything like that. It's just pure mechanical training. And not only that, but unfortunately at this stage I'm kind of sabotaging myself, because not only am I failing at the drawing, I'm also failing at the values. I'm just trying to do too many things. So when you try and do multiple skills together and you're not really trained at either of them very well, then really you end up with a result that's compoundedly worse. So at this stage, if I could give myself advice, it would be to just drop the value, drop the tones at this stage, and just try and replicate the shapes. Just try and put things in the right place. I think I've gotten the proportion just slightly off. I think this corner would have had to move a little bit, so I think I've made the eye a little bit smaller. So it will be just advice like that. It will be just have a look at these shapes, see how I've straightened this corner up, and because of that I've just made the shape a little bit more static. There's a little bit less of the character present because of that. So just try and pay attention to these things, and don't try and do them in value, but just try and be correct with the shape. So you don't necessarily have to put tone on it. You don't even need to finish it. You don't need to have a finished drawing at the end of this thing. Just try and get these things a little bit more correct. Try and pay attention to just relationships between different shapes, and don't do the entire head necessarily. So this is another thing I would advise myself. Don't do the whole entire thing. You don't have to. There's so many shapes and so many relationships when you have to do this whole thing. It would be better to just do one thing correctly. So I would just spend my time, let's say, just doing this one eye, just getting this one shape as correctly as I possibly can. And then if I wanted to, maybe render out the eye, but just forget about the rest of the head. Or if I'm done with the eye, or you can even think about the whole portrait almost piecemeal. Like you can think about, let's say, the face shape, and if we can get this correct, so if we can get this one shape correct, then maybe focus on the next thing. Then maybe focus on just, let's place the eye then let's just place the other eye. But I wouldn't advise myself to do absolutely everything and to demand that it's correct, because it would really be better if we just got one thing. So let's just, if we looked at the hair, for instance, this could be a better shape than what it is currently. Now the problem at this stage is that I'm really not understanding the importance of these shapes, and I wouldn't have been paying attention to them anyway. I would just be making everything just slightly worse kind of than it already was, because that was my skill level at the time. But you can see that almost every single shape is just slightly off. It's just slightly a bit more straightened up or slightly of a different proportion. So the overall effect is just slightly worse than what it was. And so also some figure drawing first tries. And I remember at that time, I really didn't understand what figure drawing is for. I kind of thought it's anatomy. And if you know anatomy, there's no point in doing this stuff because you'll know how to draw figures. And obviously that's incorrect. Figure drawing is basically a different skill. They go together with anatomy, but really figure drawing is just trying to get alignments and gesture essentially correct. You're trying to have all of these complicated objects that are going to fit together in a particular way to design what the figure is going to feel like, essentially. Because the anatomy itself, Steve Houston from New Masters Academy describes that really great, and I find that to be a great way to think about not just figure drawing, but really any type of image that you're making. There's gesture and there's structure, and you want to get the gesture, which is the curves, which is the flow, which is how things are going to be fitting into each other, how they're going to give you a greater whole, a beautiful design. And then the structure, the anatomy, goes over top of that. And structure tends to stiffen things up. So if you think anatomy only, you probably end up with something that's kind of stiff, just like most of these drawings, because I'm really not pushing the gesture enough. I'm not giving the figure any design, any movement, any three-dimensional motion. I'm just kind of, at this stage, really, I couldn't. So I'm not criticizing this. I just didn't have the technical capability at the time to think through all these things. My main concern was just trying to make these shapes and put them in the right place, in the right relationship to each other. So I'm mostly just struggling, for instance, to just get the proportions right, to just make things aligned. And you can see just everything is slightly stiff. You know, this figure is quite vertical, and then this is almost like a 90-degree angle, really. So everything is very straight and very rigidly connected to everything else. This is, if you look at the head and if you look at the leg, they're kind of the same angle. So the whole entire figure just ends up being quite stiff. But this is just beyond my capabilities to think about gesture at this time. I'm essentially just practicing accuracy at this stage. And this is why I've essentially labeled these things as they are. It just 2013, I couldn't have been able to draw things beautifully and make all that stuff. All I'm trying here is to just develop observation, train my perceptual skills a bit more, try and make the correct shape in the correct proportion, and then try and relate it with other shapes. And this is a massively complicated skill. To make a drawing like this, I mean, this takes years of practice. Not only that, but something like this, it isn't just done purely by eye. When you're doing a drawing that has to be very mechanically precise, you also want to use as many measuring devices as you possibly can. People use a sight size method, it's called, where they're essentially, if you're drawing from life, you move your canvas or your paper at a distance that the object looks at the size that you would like to have it on your paper. So you can essentially kind of translate it just completely over onto your page. So you don't have to also think about proportions and resize things as you go. People would also be using a plumb line, which would be a vertical that goes through the center, kind of representing this line really, but this is mostly for alignment here. But you would have a line that just goes through, and you would have a line just going over your model, and then you would have the same line in the same place on your paper, and you would be measuring against that. You can also, of course, use your pen or your pencil to just measure where things are, measure angles, measure alignments, all of those things. Artists have come up with crazy devices over the years, just all kinds of grids. They built entire rooms that they would go into that would act like a camera, anything to simplify this process, this technical and mechanical process, which is so difficult to just get things in the correct place, in the right shape, with the correct proportion. This is massively difficult. It's hard for one shape, but when you have 5-10 shapes that are within one bigger shape, this is a massively more complicated problem. This is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm saying that because if this is where you are, don't feel bad that your drawings are not what you would like them to be, that they may be stiff, that they might be off. This is just to be expected. Until you train this and you do this many, many times. My entire year was essentially primarily spent on training accuracy, and I was also doing painting and things like that on the side. So I'll show you, I was trying to study some anatomy at the time, and this is from imagination. You can see proportions are off and all that stuff, but you know, I'm just trying. You have to keep trying these things and just fail and do it again and fail and do it again and just keep doing it. You know, at some point it just has to be something that you do on a daily basis. Like an athlete would train, it's just your practice. And so this is 2013, and just the overall here is just observation and trying to develop some accuracy. I'll show you, this is the majority of the work from 2013. So I'll just scroll you through just to give you an idea of the volume, basically. So this is 2013. A lot of it is pretty much paintings, and these are gonna have all the same issues. My work was absolutely no better than any other beginners. So this is the majority of the work from 2013. Okay. Right, just a bunch of work. And this has been the same thing over and over for every year. So 2014, after having developed a little bit more accuracy, and the reason for this accuracy and the necessity of it is that, like we said before, if I'm just struggling to make the correct shapes and to just fit them together properly, if I can't do those, then really it's a massive constraint on any type of further work that I want to make. If I can't even draw something from an image that everything is already there, so if I can just copy something where all the problems are essentially solved, then how in the world could I possibly make something up, which is a far more complicated thing to do. So essentially, mostly just having technical constraints, technical issues, and then working through those. And when I got a bit better at accuracy, I was then trying to, this is level 2 now, which is understanding over here. And it's actually understanding and copying still, so you don't go level 1 then level 2. You're normally, okay, level 1, but can I do a little bit of level 2? And then you go back, okay, more level 1, and then, okay, level 2, and then maybe a little bit of level 3, and then back level 1, level 2. So you keep going backwards and forwards like that. So over here you can see a lot of sketches, and these are not just copying anymore, they are perspective now. So I'm trying to actually understand how an image is put together rather than just copying it as flat shapes. I'm now trying to think more about volume and understand space and how things are built and do things like that, just construct things rather than just copy them. So even though I would be looking at things as I'm making these, I'm not just copying the image, let's say, I'm trying to reconstruct it, which is a harder skill to do. And I'm also deconstructing objects here. So I would look at something, I think this is either Feng Zhu or Scott Robertson, possibly. I think it's probably from his How to Draw book. So I'm just trying to redraw some of his drawings, but reconstruct them as well. You can see that you can feel where the other side of the vehicle is here that you actually can't see. So this is just doing some of this basic practice, just looking at things not as shapes anymore, but as volumes, and trying to think volumetrically and three-dimensionally, and a whole bunch of these and more of that. So this is basically a lot of perspective and a lot of construction over top of that. And perspective is something that's been massively difficult for me. I have absolutely no intuitive sense for perspective. I feel nothing in space. If something's horribly wrong, I tend to not see it. So perspective's been one of the most difficult things for me to do. And not just perspective, like the theory part of it, that's fairly easy to get, but being able to draw on it and use this skill has been massively hard. I remember when I would be doing it, I would have this like feeling in my head of just like, this is hard. I would get fatigued so quickly. I would just be tired. I'd have no idea where I am in space. I would connect lines that don't go together, and I would just need a nap after like 30 minutes of doing this stuff. I just couldn't stand it anymore. It's like the hardest mental exercise for me has been just doing perspective stuff. Then 2015 to 2017, I really didn't draw much. I was mostly taking a lot of courses from concept art, concept design, just industry people. So I was learning a lot about different tools and what techniques they use and how to put images together that have this photographic quality. So I was experimenting a lot with 3D, different software, photo bashing, things like that. So 2015 to 2017, I really didn't make much progress on my drawing, even though these images, they do require the ability for you to understand space and to be able to position things. So even if you're not necessarily drawing too many things, you are still using all of that foundational stuff. Now the problem is, as I realized at about end of 2017, is that I really lacked a lot of foundation. So a lot of these images, I had very technical ways of generating them. The understanding of space is there, but really there just isn't much drawing. So 2017, end of 2017, I realized I want to go more into drawing. And it's not until this time, so 2017, 2018, that I got into level 3 of feeling form. And I spent an entire year offline. So I disappeared, basically. I didn't post anything anywhere, and I was just getting to work each and every day. I signed up for New Masters Academy, and I stayed with them for an entire year. And I primarily studied with Steve Houston, Glenn Vilppu, and afterwards I also started watching a lot of Bill Perkins's stuff. So he does a lot of composition. So this is outside of the scope here, but his stuff I just found absolutely genius in terms of understanding pictorial language and organization of images, things like that, just invaluable knowledge. But Steve Houston and Glenn Vilppu, I spent a year with them, and I did this challenge of 10,000 drawings, and it didn't take me the entire year. I finished it in several months because I was just drawing all the time. I did so many drawings, and after each drawing I would put a number. That I remember I was on the bus one time and I was sketching before work, and I was just making drawings, and I felt like putting a number on it because I made such a habit of this thing because I was constantly drawing that every single drawing I made, I had the compulsion to number it as well because I was just so used to making tons and tons of drawings and also having to count them for the 10K. So it's not until I did the 10,000 drawings that I started even understanding that there is this thing that I now call feeling form. And this is something that I got from Glenn Vilppu, the way that he describes as he's drawing. He's essentially always narrating what it is that he's doing, and he's primarily concerned with structure and space. So you'll hear him, let's say if he's doing a head drawing, you'll hear him say, so I'm feeling the corner of the brow, and I'm moving over, I'm going to the front plane, and then I'm feeling under, and it's the glabella, and then the nose is coming out. So he'll be narrating the three-dimensional space, the thinking that goes for him to be able to construct this thing, and just literally he is almost recreating the space. So if drawing is creating an illusion for someone to look at, a fake world, essentially, you're making this window into a space that doesn't really exist. So for him, he's constantly just going over what it is that he's drawing, where it is in space, and this is really all that it takes for you to be able to construct and draw something. So I really wasn't understanding what he meant first when he would be saying like, I'm feeling the pectoralis, I'm feeling how it inserts, I'm feeling the pull of the deltoid, I'm feeling how these muscles are pulling, I'm feeling the compression. I really had no idea what it is that he means, but later on I realized that he is just so well trained and he understands space essentially so intuitively that it really does feel to his brain like true space. He's not really trying to construct things in perspective laboriously and measure points and things like that. He has gotten to the stage where perspective is really internalized. It's become intuitive, and he truly is just kind of moving around in space on this flat piece of paper. His brain has encoded the space, basically. So if drawing is an illusion, you have to be, as the magician, you have to be the first one to believe the illusion. You have to trick yourself before you trick anyone else. So when you're actually beginning to feel the space, it becomes a lot easier to communicate volumes and structure to other people that are looking at your drawing. So I still took 10,000 drawings though, but this also unlocked for me this idea of using drawing to learn about things and not just being constrained by shapes and volumes and just trying to copy all the time. I finally understood here that you can use drawing to learn about objects, that through drawing something as you're thinking about its form and structure, that you're essentially becoming kind of like a constructionist. You're becoming an architect of something. And when you get familiar with the volume of something and how it's put together, then you can really start at some point not needing to look at the reference because you've done it so many times. Not only that, but if you are looking at reference and you've drawn the same thing, let's say a few hundred times before that, then you have all these other hundreds of times worth of experience that you can apply into your drawing. So let's say if something isn't very visible and you would like to clarify it and you know that it's there because you've done structured drawings of what it is that you're doing, you can now use that previous knowledge to enrich your current drawings. So this process begins to happen where each and every drawing can build up the other drawings that you're doing. It isn't about copying anymore. It isn't about these shapes that are unique problems each and every time. It begins to be this more organized database of knowledge that you can start using. Essentially, that is what the visual library is. But when I would first hear that term, I would just think that if I draw something, somehow magically I now have it or that I can use it. And it really isn't until I developed my technical understanding more that I could actually just feel that I can now draw upon these things that I've done before. I had maybe also perhaps I developed better visual memory at the time, or it might be that just the technical ability was so prohibitive for me to be able to do anything more complex that I could never have the technical mastery to actually reuse something that isn't right in front of me. So I did my 10,000 drawings with Steve Houston and Glenn Vilppu's teachings. So a lot of the drawings still weren't very pretty and they weren't great. It just took quite a lot in order for me to start feeling structure and form in my head. So you can see these are about almost 3,000 over here. These are the first ones. And really, I mean, there is some difference in these, but this is some of the first times where I'm actually trying and I'm using this cross contour, but I'm using this contour not as a stylistic tool. I'm actually trying to feel what the space is here. I'm trying to feel the volume and explain it essentially to myself as I'm doing it. So there's still a lot of proportional issues with the beginning drawings, it's very hard to get multiple things right at the same time, which is why I said I always encourage to do things separately. So you can see that the proportions would be off with most of these, but really I'm mostly focused on volume. That's why the proportions would be off, because I'm too concerned with just trying to get 3 dimensions correct. So this is kind of a hybrid thinking between 2D and 3D. So this is quite difficult, or at least it was for me. So it took me quite a few drawings because I was able to then also start adjusting proportion, so get the proportion a bit more correct. And a lot of these are also stylized, you know, they're longer or they're somehow designed so they're not just completely one-to-one copy. So I started going away also from this need to copy everything one-to-one in order to feel like it's correct. I started doing things a bit more loosely, and a lot of that is due to Steve Houston. I would see that the way that he draws, he isn't just redrawing the drawing. His drawing is actually better than what it is that he's drawing from. I started at this stage to try and steer away from the reference and use it structurally and use it for what I need, but also just put my own thing in there. So these are in progress, so you can see the proportions are a bit off, but you can also feel the difference here in how I used to draw before. This is pretty far away from the symbolic drawing or from the figures that are just basically shapes that are fitting together. You can just feel how much I'm thinking about structure over here. So even though the proportions are a bit off, and even though the perspective isn't perfect and some of the forms don't fit very well, I'm still thinking and I'm training my ability to understand volumes. That's really what's the most important thing. So I'm always thinking volume. I'm always thinking about the parts that I'm not seeing, and I'm trying to describe to my brain the space, not just copy shapes. So all the drawings here, they're essentially the same theme. They're the same type of training. And also, combined with that, I did some more perspective practice, and I'm still doing things like this, where this is more deconstructing objects. This is Feng Zhu again, and you can see kind of the grids, the perspective, and I'm just trying to construct these things. You can't really see too much cross contour over here, and that's because at this stage I'm trying to not need it as much. I've developed the ability to kind of just feel a little bit more how things are oriented in space, so I need less lines in order to describe something to my brain and feel that it's dimensional. So this is kind of the next level, is when I can go back to not needing to have all of these lines and all this description everywhere, where I can just make just a shape, let's say, and I could feel now that this is actually dimensional, that this isn't just a line. So if I just leave it open like this, my brain is essentially think, okay, this is a tube. So this is when dimension is a little bit more encoded basically into my brain. And this, I feel, has a top plane. So even without drawing these, at this stage, my brain just kind of feels, okay, well, this shape continues like this. And let's say it has something like that. And then we can maybe continue it this way. So at this stage, it's just easier to do this stuff. And this looks two-dimensional. It just looks like a shape. But really, to my brain, it just looks like this. It feels like this. So by doing so many of these drawings where I'm consciously trying to describe the volume to myself, I get to the point where I don't need to describe it so much. I just get it. And this is endless. You know, this is always something that could be trained more into a higher level. And I talk on YouTube a lot about projects and practice. As you're practicing these things, as you're doing your straight lines, your figures, your whatever, have something in mind. Have something in mind that you are doing all this practice for. You know, go and do something that isn't just a bunch of drawings, that isn't just 10,000 drawings, but it's also, let me just try and refine ahead a bit more. Let me try and do a painting. Let me try and do an image, because these things, these projects, they expose a lot more peripheral skills that need developing, whether it's storytelling, or it might be lighting, or it might be color, or it might be any of those other things that as you're in your rabbit hole of training, that you're doing those things that you may neglect or you might forget. So always have a project as well, because it will keep you engaged with the bigger picture of why you're doing all of this daily continuous work. Okay, so now let's have a look at the levels more in depth.